Hundreds of young people across Northern Ireland are now identifying as transgender.
I didn't feel comfortable identifying as a boy.
It can have a huge impact on a young person's daily life.
I have been called names by total strangers. I have been screamed at coming off trains. I have been followed.
It's also a challenge for families.
I did go through a grieving process because my wee girl was leaving me. And it took me a wee while just to get my head around it.
Tonight, we reveal the number of under-18s who are being referred to a gender identity clinic and ask if they should be getting hormone interventions to change their bodies.
I think we might look back and think, actually, we were sleepwalking into a whole load of unnecessary medical treatments, and we were psychologically blinded by the wish to appear politically correct.
We ask how society should respond to young people who identify as transgender.
We have children who don't eat or drink at all before 4 p.m. when they get home because they don't feel safe in any of the bathrooms in school.
And we look at some of the emerging battlegrounds, like the rights of transgender women to use women's bathrooms.
It's a complete infringement on women's rights to say we're now going to allow people who say they feel like a woman into your safe spaces.
Is Northern Ireland ready to grapple with complex gender politics?
We're everywhere, really. Like, that's... You have met a trans person, whether you know it or not. We're here, and, you know, that's not really going to change.
Meet Phelan.
I'm Phelan, and I'm a young person that studies, and I'm a trans man.
And this is Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I am currently studying A-levels. I'm from Uri, and I really love gaming, baking and activism.
In many ways, Phelan and Alex are just like any other teenager in Northern Ireland. But they're also very different. They describe themselves as transgender. That means that they don't identify with the gender they were born with. Phelan was born female, but has been living as a male for the last few years.
I would describe myself as any other man would. I'm just a man like any other fellow would be.
Alex was born male, but since 2014 has identified as being transgender.
I do remember having that feeling whenever I was younger, that, you know, I didn't feel comfortable identifying as a boy, and I, you know, didn't feel comfortable with that label.
In recent years, celebrities, actors and sporting stars have declared themselves to be transgender. It's a word that's gaining recognition across the globe. In 2015, Olympian and reality TV star Bruce Jenner announced he was transitioning to Caitlyn Jenner, arguably now the most famous transgender celebrity, bringing the issues to a wider audience with her own TV series.
Is there something you'd like to know? I'm your wife.
And the concept of being trans has had a touch of Hollywood glamour, with films like The Danish Girl.
Lily, we should go out tonight.
Transgender issues are now starting to register in the public consciousness.
You're exquisite.
Through a Freedom of Information request, Spotlight has discovered over 1,000 adults have been referred to the Northern Ireland Gender Identity Clinic since 2014. Last year, 73 under-18s with gender identity issues came forward. Many of them will come along here, to the Trans Resource Centre in Belfast. It's run by a 24-year-old trans woman from Fermanagh, Ellen Murray.
Hi, Ellen. Hi, Peter.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Peter.
A trans person is someone who identifies as a different gender than what was on their birth certificate, and there's a whole host of different experiences within that.
Around 400 young people who have questioned their gender identity use its services. Phelan is a regular here and is a trustee of a transgender peer support group called Gender Jam, helping out with a service providing chest binders which help flatten breasts.
So Phelan, tell me a bit about what's going on here then.
Well, these are binders. They're actually There can be very, very life-saving pieces of equipment. I say equipment, and they're clothes that basically go over a person's chest, and it gives the flat impression, well, flattens out the chest and gives the impression of a more masculine sort of appearance. They're extremely comfortable, contrary to what they actually look like. They look absolutely torturous.
What was it like when you put yours on for the first time?
It was euphoria. I loved it. It was the best thing ever. Because I was like, just this massive sort of mental sort of hurt just melted away. And I was like, this is great. I could pull a shirt on and there was just nothing there.
So you just standing looking in the mirror with a shirt on?
I think I stood there for a good 5 minutes, was like, wow, is this actually real?
When a young person feels that they identify as transgender, they might change their clothes, hair and their name. This is called socially transitioning. But Phelan has gone a step further and has also started using testosterone patches.
Some days I go out and I forget that I'm trans, and I'm like, great, I'm just like any other lad in the street.
What's a typical day like for you?
Typical day? It's like anyone else's day, with extra steps. I get up, put on my testosterone, I put on my binder, I wash my face, I brush my teeth, I go get something to eat, go get the train, and I come into college.
Sometimes simply just being out in public can be enough to attract unwanted attention.
What's life like as a young trans man in 2018 in Belfast?
Difficult. I have been heckled on the streets. I have been called names by total strangers. I have been screamed at coming off trains. I have been followed. I have been quite closely assaulted in bathrooms. It was horrendously intimidating, and it stopped me from using the bathrooms for quite a long time.
Phelan has been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. It's a psychological condition where a person feels distress, trapped in the wrong sex. Phelan had always felt something was wrong, but hadn't known how to describe it.
There was the initial relief that there is words for it, such as transgender, gender fluid, all that sort of stuff, but then came the wave of anxiety that was like, oh God, what am I doing to myself? What have I chosen? I wouldn't say it's a choice, but it was a choice that I acted on the feelings.
Talking about those feelings wasn't easy at first.
I only started to bring it up with family about 4 years ago. So it was a difficult process because I think my mother wasn't ready at the time to hear that sort of thing, but she kind of rolled with it. There were a few bumps on the way, but now she's really, really out and advocating about it, and I love her to bits for that reason.
Was it easy being transgender at school?
No. It was horrendous being trans at school because I was bullied quite heavily. I was harassed outside school, especially in secondary school, because fellas in the year below had started hitting out at me. Well, not physically, but verbally. All the usual derogatory terms, calling me, you know, he, she, and everything else. It was difficult to hear.
Phelan eventually dropped out of school after finishing his GCSEs and is now studying healthcare at college. Alex is still at school, but finds it hard.
It's kind of like, okay, I'm going into this environment where I'm not wanted, where I'm not liked, where people despise me for my gender, where I'm getting harassed, and it's kind of like you don't want to go there, and it's just really, really draining to be there.
Alex had been exploring a few different genders and identities while at school. But as the first openly trans student, Alex says the school initially felt unable to accept Alex's preferred new name. But Alex says one of the biggest problems was bullying.
There was a lot of bullying and harassment and abuse of me, specifically naming in the corridors. There was a lot of names being hurled at me, and they did attempt to kind of stamp that out.
Alex goes to an all-boys school and says things are now starting to get easier. Government research shows that young people who identify as transgender are much more likely to be bullied, feel isolated, have mental health issues, and drop out of school. One of the key issues for schools is providing gender-neutral toilets.
We have children who don't eat or drink at all before 4 p.m. when they get home because they don't feel safe in any of the bathrooms in school, and they're not allowed to use the ones they would feel safe in.
Being a teenager can be tough. Do you look good? Do you fit in? And what on earth is going on with your body? But for trans teens, these feelings can be a lot worse. So should trans teens be able to take medication called hormone blockers to stop puberty? Some also want to take cross-sex hormones, which can be used to make the body more masculine or feminine. It's a highly contentious debate. Dr. Helen Weberly provides online GP services for transgender people. She is currently under investigation by the General Medical Council for prescribing cross-sex hormones to a 12-year-old. NHS guidelines say they should only be prescribed when the young person is around 16. She says hormone blockers are a key element of treatment.
It stops the hormone production. And what it does is it gives that child the time and space to explore their gender identity without doing anything that's irreversible. Just to give that child months, years to actually really explore, are they a boy or are they a girl? Without this fear of puberty. And it is a fear that your voice is going to break, that your Adam's apple is going to grow, that your jaw is going to angulate, your chin is going to sprout hairs, and you're going to turn into a masculine, male-looking person when actually you so strongly identify as female. Or on the converse, it stops somebody who identifies as a young boy from all of a sudden developing breasts and hips and periods, which is very distressing for young boys.
Dr. Weberly's treated 18 people in Northern Ireland, including 5 under the age of 18. Brighton, where the Transgender Pride Festival is held each year. Psychotherapist Robert Withers is based here. He thinks some medical professionals are too quick to prescribe blockers, and also cross-sex hormones. He considers cross-sex hormones to be the first step towards medical transition and irreversible. He questions if those under 18 are really capable of making such life-changing decisions.
I'd say that with young people, they tend to indulge in quite risky behaviour when they're young, and they also tend to change their minds quite a lot. If they make a decision which is actually going to change their lives and be irreversible, before they've settled into a kind of a clear sense of who they are and their own identity, then I would think even one person medically transitioning before they reach that maturity would be too many.
He suggests that any rush for drugs may miss other related emotional and psychological problems, and that medical treatment should be the last resort.
For somebody to do something irreversible to their bodies before they become fully mature in that way, my opinion again, is a serious mistake. And if we're allowing that or condoning it as a society, we're letting the people who have such medical treatment down, in my opinion.
His views are shared by Stephanie Davis RI, who runs a website called Transgender Trend. It offers guidance to parents who are worried about the consequences of hormone treatment.
A child at age 10, for example, who's going on to puberty blockers, is essentially making the decision to be sterilised at that age because we know they are overwhelmingly likely to progress to cross-sex hormones.
Alex is on the waiting list for an appointment at the Gender Identity Clinic. Alex believes hormone blockers should be prescribed.
It's not really a debate as to whether young people should be having them or not, because if there is a danger that young people will be forced to go through an irreversible puberty that they do not want, that can be incredibly damaging and could have lifelong consequences to a person's health and mental health and their perception of their body.
Hormone blockers are a life-saving thing for a lot of people, but these people are saying that it stunts mental growth, it stunts a lot of things.
Stephanie Davis RI had gender dysphoria throughout her teens and into her early 20s, but she says it eventually passed. She thinks the side effects of blockers and cross-sex hormones could do more harm than good.
There is a high incidence of pre-existing either mental health or emotional issues such as anxiety and depression and self-harming. And often these kids are different in some way, and we need to be very, very careful about giving those children hormonal treatments which will affect their moods.
Theologian and former doctor Paul Coulter says whatever the medical intervention, people continue to be the sex they were born with.
From a Christian point of view, I suppose the bigger question for me is I believe there's a creator and there's a design. The reality is that the genes in your cells remain the chromosomes and the genes that you've had from birth. So in one sense, all of those changes are cosmetic. I don't mean that to minimise them in any sense, and I know for some people they can be very significant, but it doesn't correspond to fundamentally changing the nature of who you are. And I don't think people necessarily understand that.
For children and teens in Northern Ireland experiencing symptoms of gender dysphoria, the place to be assessed is here at the COI Clinic, short for Knowing Our Identity. It's been operating here at Beechcroft in Belfast since 2014. Through our Freedom of Information request, we've discovered that more than 240 young people have been referred to COI since it opened. Waiting lists are increasing, and it's extended the service from 2 to 4 days a week.
We have lots of young people who are quite honestly begging for treatment, but are not being provided it.
Ellen Murray regards COI as an important service, but thinks it has some shortcomings.
It's having difficulty adapting to the demand upon it, and we're not seeing the type of resource or investment into the service as it needs, unfortunately.
Gender dysphoria is defined as a mental illness, and that's central to COI's approach with young people. It provides counselling and carries out extensive psychiatric assessments.
Generally, if there's no distress with the child, then I wouldn't rush to do anything. We are about assessment and intervention in a very timely, slow, steady way to make sure it's the right thing for the child at the right time. And most interventions happen when the young person's an adult. And it's a very small number that we give some physiological intervention to in terms of blockers. Young people come sometimes wanting blockers very quickly because they think, well, if we just stop the development of this physiology I'm in, everything will be okay. When actually, it's a process of exploring their own physiology and whether a prescription of blockers would be right for them. And it's a very small number that it is right for.
Would you describe COI's approach as watchful waiting, or how would you describe it?
It probably is a bit of watchful waiting and probably feels quite frustrating at times to young people, but it's probably more about trying to assure them about why rushing isn't a good idea.
Figures obtained by Spotlight show that since COI began operating, fewer than 10 young people have been given either hormone blockers or cross-sex hormones.
I'm really shocked that only 3 or 4% of children and young people who've been referred to your service have had any kind of medical hormone blocker or hormone treatment. I think that's a really low statistic, and I'm not quite sure why it would be. If you've had 242 children referred to the service over the last 4 years, and only maybe less than 10 of those had had any kind of medical treatment, I'd be really worried about what would happen to the other 230 children and young people, particularly if they do suffer from gender identity disorder but haven't been given treatment. There's a high incidence of suicide and self-harm in this patient group.
The Belfast Trust that runs COI told us young people coming to COI often do not receive any medical hormonal treatment for a number of reasons. A false assumption is being made here that all of the young people attending COI want physical interventions. This is not the case. Phelan says he desperately wanted to start hormones to begin to change his body, and at points felt very low. Using testosterone patches has helped.
Are you starting to feel any change yet, or
I feel normal, just as I've always wanted to be. It was a wave of relief. It took away a lot of dysphoria, it took away a lot of sort of like the mental struggle that was there before, tussling with the idea of not being able to, have the proper voice and everything, but now it's excellent.
Phelan pays about £60 per month for his hormone medication, which is prescribed by a GP. Phelan went down the private route, but some people are buying their medication off the internet. They're self-medicating. Buying hormones online without a prescription may be unlawful and is potentially dangerous.
There are significant risks to self-medicating, absolutely. There are also significant risks to not self-medicating. We never say self-medicate, we never advise it. It's something that I think should be avoided, if at all possible. For young people, for example, who are maybe 17, 18, 19, who are going through incredible stress and torment because of their mental health problems, because of gender dysphoria, for example, is that a way to keep some people safe from self-harm, safe from suicide? It absolutely is.
Well, I would advise that no young person would do that, because really you need to think about your physical assessment, and having the right dose for the right person is key, and that needs to be done with a doctor rather than just bought online.
Trans people still face indignities and prejudice when they deserve understanding and respect.
Providing more protection against transgender discrimination and bullying was a Conservative election pledge last year. Currently, you need a gender recognition certificate to officially change your gender. But now the government is considering a new and easier approach of self-identification, known as self-ID. It means anyone can choose to identify as male, female, or neither gender. So a trans person could legally change their gender without requiring any medical evidence of a sex change. It's fuelled a bitter debate over whether trans women can be real women if they haven't had surgery to remove their male genitalia. That's known as a full transition. The row has hit the Labour Party after some of its members started to disagree and caused outrage in the press and social media. Writer Nora Coulter is one of a number of feminists who has taken issue with self-ID and its implications for women's rights, with those born male wanting to use women's-only spaces.
I don't feel that my views are extreme. I consider myself to be a trans ally for those who go through the process of transitioning. However, self-ID I'm not as comfortable with, because I believe it infringes on women's rights a lot of the time.
Women who believe trans women can never be real women are nicknamed TERFs, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists, and they are generally hostile to trans women. Nora says she is not a TERF, but has been labelled as one.
How do we make sure that there's a differentiation between someone who self-IDs and someone who has gone through a full transition, and how do we also protect women?
If someone does identify as a woman, though, should they not be given access to bathrooms and changing rooms and women's spaces?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, we can't ignore that male violence is an issue. It's a complete infringement on women's rights to say we're now going to allow people who say they feel like a woman into your safe spaces. We can't take away from the fact that we have males and females. We're different, and it's because of their genitals. We're different, and we can't ignore biology.
Nora is a lesbian and became involved in a row online after saying she would not be prepared to have a relationship with a trans woman who used to be a man. She says shortly afterwards she started to get abuse online from trans activists.
The trans lobby, I believe, are a minority of the trans community. The power also comes from the fact that everyday people fear speaking about it because they fear that they'll be labelled transphobic.
Ellen Murray rejects the idea that trans women are somehow a threat.
It's always about trans women, it's always about trans women taking women's spaces, it's always about trans women being predatory or invasive to women's spaces as a whole. and I think that needs to be challenged in every situation.
Ellen feels there is hostility between trans women and radical feminists. She has had surgery, a physical sex change, and says she has had some problems when using women's bathrooms.
Is it something you've ever encountered yourself, of being approached in bathrooms or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something that it happens quite rarely for me. I'm very lucky in that respect. However, a lot of trans women especially will have significant barriers to using bathrooms. Toilets have always been a battleground for civil rights and human rights, and they have been they were one of the battlegrounds for black civil rights in America. They are one of the battlegrounds for disabled people's rights, both here and around the world, and again now for trans people's rights.
And it's an ongoing issue for Alex.
Generally, I am forced to use the accessible toilet because there's no gender-neutral bathrooms. Whenever I did use the male toilets, I got a lot of looks. It was like, oh, you shouldn't really be here.
Would you feel comfortable using female toilets?
Well, I'm not a woman, so no. And I don't feel any need to.
For Nora, though, this all comes back to people being able to self-identify. She thinks if a trans woman has surgery to remove her penis, she can then be considered to have changed gender and can use women-only spaces.
I believe there needs to be a sensible debate on it, and if that means, you know, taking the gender recognition back to where somebody has to medically transition, and that's what's required to protect women and trans women alike, then I believe we should look at that.
Dr. Paul Coulter says that while he recognises that gender dysphoria is a psychological condition, he doesn't think that taking the transgender route is the solution to the medical condition.
I think gender dysphoria certainly exists because it's a diagnosis based on the experience and the feelings that people are expressing and the distress that they're expressing. But that's not the same as asking whether transgender identity exists as such.
Some people now don't see gender identity as either being just male or female, but say there is a whole range of genders to choose from.
They say gender is something that's fluid, that can evolve and change.
In fact, social media giant Facebook recently gave users 71 different options when it came to choosing their gender. Alex doesn't identify as either male or female. This is called being non-binary.
Non-binary refers to like a wide spectrum of genders that aren't male or female. So there's an infinite amount of genders on this gender spectrum, and any that are off that binary are just under the umbrella term non-binary. I also just use it as a term to describe my own gender. That's really hot. I love it.
Alex doesn't use he or she pronouns and prefers using they or them. Throughout childhood, Alex didn't feel comfortable as a boy.
One thing I do remember is telling my grandmother whenever I was 9 that I wanted to be a girl. And that's a really strong memory for me. Nothing ever came of that. Because I didn't know any of the terminology or anything, and it was kind of shut down at that point. But I do remember having that feeling whenever I was younger that, I didn't feel comfortable identifying as a boy, and I didn't feel comfortable with that label.
Yeah, and what do you think?
But Alex never totally put those feelings aside, and during second year at school, Alex came out as bisexual.
That's nice and trans.
Yeah.
I love it. And so I went from identifying as a trans woman to non-binary, back to woman again, and I've kind of settled now for the past 2 years on identifying as non-binary. And so it really was like a kind of gradual discovering myself sort of thing. I mean, I'm always going to explore my gender, and I'm always going to keep exploring myself, but I feel like this is it. Like, I feel like I'm a non-binary person, and I'm happy enough with that.
So that is 2004 altogether then, please.
With my dad's side of the family, it was a learning curve, really. So there was like kind of, periods where they still called me by my birth name, my name assigned to me at birth by them, for a good year and a bit, and then there was kind of moving into you know, calling me by my preferred name, my now legal name, Alex, and kind of trying to familiarise with themselves with being trans and stuff like that. So it is quite, it's a steep learning curve, really, and I don't know if I expected them to get it like that.
How important is it to have your dad's acceptance of Alex?
That's incredibly important, and it does actually really mean a lot that he is there for me, and I know that, like, you know, whatever happens, he will kind of be on my side.
The group SEAL was set up to try and support families of transgender people like Alex. The organisation is run by Nicola Doran and receives around £25,000 of public money. It supports around 300 parents across Northern Ireland.
They can be very fearful of talking to anyone and very, very guarded over the anonymity and confidentiality of the young person or child that they're seeking help or support for. And there have been lots and lots of conversations with parents and children and young people trying to make sense themselves of what it is they're feeling. I've spoken to parents who have almost bargained with their child, you know, and said, well, like, let's try things this way and let's do things that way, and maybe you'll feel better.
Some parents feel that they are judged for how they handle the situation.
We do have families come along and say, you know, I know that we're going to lose friends by supporting our child. And families will sometimes talk about having to choose between friends and family members and doing what they believe is right for their child.
One of the services that SEAL offers is weekly meetings where the parents of transgender children can talk about their experiences. Stephen and Shirley from Magabry are parents to Connor, who transitioned from female to male at 18. At the time, Shirley says they thought they were the only family going through this.
It was so frightening. It was very, very frightening. I felt so isolated. And all I wanted to do when Connor came out to us, I wanted to keep him safe. That was my main concern. And then I was desperate to meet another mum and just sit and talk to another mum, because I knew another mum would know exactly how I was feeling. It is a very emotional time for parents. It's not just the child who's transitioning, the parents are also transitioning.
You hear a lot of people saying with gender dysphoria and gender identity that, oh, it's a phase, let young people be young people, it'll pass.
Well, if they were ever to get to know a trans person, they would know it's not a choice. It's blatantly obvious. No one would put themselves through what a lot of those trans kids have to go through. It just wouldn't happen.
How did you cope with it?
I went to bits. Went to absolute bits, and I did go through a grieving process because my wee girl was leaving me, and it took me a wee while just to get my head around it and think that, you know, Connor's here, I love Connor to bits, I wouldn't change a hair on Connor's head. He's a gorgeous big fella, Peter, he's lovely, but that, okay, Shirley, it's just the outside has changed.
Jeannie's child Rowan is 15 and is just beginning the process of socially transitioning from male to female.
Sometimes it can be a wee bit overwhelming if you think too far into the future and you get a bit scared. I do, and I don't bring that up to Rowan because Rowan's not scared. Rowan's just, some children, I think, or my child doesn't focus on being trans, doesn't obsess with it, doesn't really even talk about it. We go to our appointments and we talk a little bit about that afterwards. But Rowan is Rowan.
The existence of individuals who feel trapped in a body of the wrong gender is not new, but many of the options open to those facing this dilemma today are very new, and in some cases quite radical. As individuals decide to change their gender, the implications of their choices have far-reaching consequences, most notably for themselves and for their families, but also for society as a whole.